Okay, let's take a look at graphing, giving the inverse and graphing y and its inverse. So recall that the way you find an inverse is we switch x and y. Way too big. And then we solve for y. Okay, so our inverse, y to the minus 1, is going to be x minus 3 squared. And what we have to do is we have to limit the domain of this inverse. It'll help if we start by graphing the original function y equals square root of x plus 3. Now, this is a translation up 3. So what we do is we just go graph our regular square root, but we start up 3. So we get a point there, and then we move over. So that would be 0, 0 up 3, and then we would graph 1, 1, move it up 3. That gives me 1, 4. And then we would graph 4, 2, move it up 3. That gives me 4, 5. Okay? So we're just translating that parent function square root of x up 3. So how do we limit the domain here? Well, first of all, one of the properties of inverses is they are always symmetrical about the line. All right, it got off. Y equals x. Okay? So one way we can look at that is to take one of our points. Let's start with the first point at 0, 3. And graphing the inverse, we'll have a point at 3, 0. Okay? And by the way, note that this is a translation right by 3. So what we're really going to do here to limit the domain and make sure that we have 1-to-1 between y and its inverse is to just graph the right side of that parabola. So our vertex moved over 3. We're going to go right 1 and up 1. There's our second point, and right 2 and up 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So notice that when we graph that, it is symmetrical about the y-axis. And if you're absolutely not sure, then just check some of the points. We start out with 0, 3 and graphed 3, 0. You could do the same with the other points instead of graphing. So we have 1, 4 graphed on y. Then we would graph 4, 1 on x. And there's 4, 1, our middle point. Sorry, not on x, but on y to the minus 1. Probably should label my graph. Okay, so we manage this by limiting the domain. So the domain of, and it comes up in a bit, of y to the minus 1 is x is going to be greater than or equal to 3. Okay, on to the next problem. Now we're just going to crunch through finding a bunch of inverses. Why did that thing get so large? Okay, pretty straightforward. We're going to turn y, f of my function notation into y. And now we're going to switch x and y. And now carefully just solve for y. And I'm saying carefully because people, I've seen this over and over throughout the years, people think they can just kind of eyeball it and find the inverse, and sometimes that's true, but not very often. And here, when we finish solving for y, instead of divided by 2, I'm going to multiply by 1/2 because I got fraction work on the left-hand side. So use a reciprocal if you got some fraction work ahead of you. So we have 1/2 x minus 3/4 equals y, but I'm going to put in my f to the minus 1 of x notation. Okay, same idea here, and I'm going to skip a few steps. I'm going to just switch x and y. I'm going to add 4, divide by 2. I better show that step. So I get 1/2 x plus 2 equals y squared. Now I'm going to take the square root. And since I have variables on both sides, I don't have to plus minus. And I need some room to write my inverse. So g to the minus 1 of x, the inverse of g is going to be the square root of x over 2 plus 2. I just wrote it smaller. Okay, give the domain of the inverse. So how do I do this? I'm going to take a look at where the restrictions are. So this is going to be restricted because we can't have a negative under a square root. So we're looking at where x over 2 plus 2 is greater than or equal to 0. That's what the square root, that's how you write the square root in an inequality if you're trying to find out where the domain is. I'm going to subtract 2, and I get x over 2 is greater than or equal to negative 2. I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. And it looks like x is going to be greater than or equal to negative 4. There's my inequality. Negative 4 to positive infinity is my interval notation. Okay. It's probably a good time to stop this video. See you on the next one.